Alrighty, another day. I hope y'all had a good Christmas. It's actually fairly warm right now, even for me. Like this is late December, which is kind of surprising for Arizona. It's supposed to be like 53 degrees outside right now. I'm like, normally at this point, we're already pretty close to low 40s and high 30s, so this is odd. But it is what it is, I guess. Now for C5s, I think it would have been interesting. I wish, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in this. I'm sure there's a lot of people like myself that wish that there was a ZR1 variant of the C5s. Yeah, obviously it never came to fruition, but I feel like if they did, I don't think it would have been like, I think it would have definitely changed how things happened for the C6 and C7, right? Because I'm like, I think if they went into a ZR1, I think obviously the only other way was two ways, right? It was they were either gonna go to a supercharged 5.7 more than likely, because they just never changed the engine on the C5s, right? It was always 5.7 the whole way through. So I'm like, all right, well, if you keep up with that trend, I'm gonna assume that the ZR1 would have been basically just a supercharged 5.7. And going with how it trended at that point, right? I think the C5s would have made about 500 horsepower, like the ZR1 variants. Like I think it would have made probably around 500 or so, pretty much. Because I'm looking at how they did it prior, where the Z06 of the next generation made as much power, or if not more, than the previous ZR1 generation, right? Because like look, right, let's start with the C4 ZR1. C4 ZR1s, especially the later years, made 405, right? 405 off the LT5. I'm like, okay, let's see what I can do. C5s, the Z06s made 405, and both of them, even on the early versions, made 385. I'm like, they pretty much made the exact same power on paper, right? So I'm like, 405 on a Z06 variant, right? And then I go from Z06 to Z06. Z06 went to 505 on the C6. C7, they bumped it up to 650. We just kept bumping it. And obviously C8, 670. You just keep going on and on. But then I look at the I look at what was going on and what the trend was that GM would kind of follow, right? So I'm like, okay, so if the Z06 had as much power as a 90s ZR1, I'm gonna assume, right? Just gonna assume that the current day ZR1, if it was a C5 current day, it would make around 500 or 500 on the dot. Whether they were going to supercharge it or go NA is up to them, right? And then you've got, I think, a C6 with the 505 and then 638 on their ZR1. But then look at that, right? Put that ZR1 638, you put the C7 Z06 and made 650. So I'm like, okay, now we're competing with that. The only one that broke the trend was the C8, but that one is obviously, that's a whole new style of Corvette. It's the only one where the Z06 variant did not have as much, if not more, power than the previous ZR1. Because I'm like, the ZR1 C7s had 755. C8 Z06s had 670. They did not bump it up to, probably, if I were to go with the trend, probably 770. But I think at that point, you could really only push that plan that they had so far with a naturally aspirated power, right? Because C7 was the one that kind of broke that mold of the Z06 variants staying naturally aspirated. C7 was the only one that ever received that. Just because that's, you know, that's where a lot of the competition was at that time, just supercharging everything. So they weren't going to try to stay behind and not do it. But yeah, like my assumption for the like a Z06 or Z06 for a C5 ZR1, my assumption would have been probably they would have obviously either tried to keep it naturally aspirated and make 500 off the 5.7. Obviously, they would have had to make, you know, new compression changes and new cylinder heads, cam, whatever the case is. I don't know, right? They're gonna have to figure that out on their own. Or supercharge it. That's probably the easiest way to do it for C5s. I'd say the only other way would have been, I think, and I think they could have done it, right? I think they could have literally put the LS7 into the C5 in 2001 to 04, that little range. But I'm like they've been using a 7-liter in GT3 world, right? Because that's kind of pretty much where the C6 Z06's engine came from. They took steps from there. Oh, hello. But it took steps from that. So I don't think it would have been crazy to say that the C5 could have had the first out of this whole brand new setup with the torque tube and everything. I feel like that they could have literally put a 7-liter in that thing, maybe even the 6 liters, right? Because the LS2 was just a bored out LS6. That's all the LS2 is. It's just an increased displacement of what the LS6 was. Power remained pretty much the same, and there wasn't much different. Right, there's still cathedral port, everything kind of stayed the same. I think maybe a slight tweaks for the car's computers, but that's about it. But I think that thing would have made at least 500, right? Or at minimum like 490, 495, pretty much where the C8 is today on a base model. But I think that's pretty much as far as you could really try to push it with what their goal was at that time, right? Because that would have been expensive, very, but the plan was to make something like fast and aerodynamic. Yeah, I think a ZR1 variant would have been insane for the C5. But at the same time, I feel like the C5's not having the ZR1 variant, or not having everything that the C6 was able to achieve, or not, let's say the C6 has everything that the C5 could not be, right? Especially with a new engine platform or new engine styling where you have rec heads instead of cathedral heads. that changed everything for the Corvettes. Because they were just, and the head float, I'm like, they were just able to do everything so much more effortless than what the C5s could pull off. Right? I'm not saying that the C5s, like the LS1s, LS6, and those engines, I'm not saying that those engines couldn't do it. Right? But from where they were, from out the gate, the C5 was never going to touch what the C6 was able to get. It sucks, but that's what they, I guess everything that they changed for the C6, I thought was pretty much any flaw or anything that they thought was wrong with the C5 in terms of competing against, well, other competitors that they were trying to beat. C6 is everything that the C5 could never be. That's just the way it was. Now, my only question for that one, actually, from the Z06 portions, if the C5 in theory had the LS7, the ZR1s of the C5s had it, I'm just wondering what would they have done for the Z06, right? Like, would they have stuck with the LS7 for the Z06 and just maybe up the power just a little bit more? Because they can, right? Like, that Z06 can handle some power, or naturally, like, just full max. Right? And then I wonder, I'm like, if that's the case, if a ZR1 of the C5s received an LS7, I'm like, and they kept the LS7 for the C6, how much power would they go to? Would they hit 600 naturally aspirated that time? You can, right? You definitely could. Like, would you just go full-blown 600 horsepower and naturally aspirated? It's not impossible, especially for us here, since we love large displacements in the States. Like, we saw the Dodge Viper, right? I know it's a whole different engine, 8 liter as the smallest, and an 8.4 liter being the largest from the factories. And they made 640 NA. But I'm like, that's, I guess, your positives of displacement. You're able to maximize what that car can do without much effort, right? It makes it effortless for the engines to make that power. Like, it just seems like a normal thing. So I'm like, how far could you push a 7 liter? At least from a manufacturing standpoint, they want to be able to push it without destroying the engine off there. I don't think they wanted to make that same mistake that they did with the North Stars, right? I don't think they want to do that again. So, especially with the Corvettes, I'm like, this is their, the top dog of Chevy. They're going to try and dial it in for those cars just because of the fact that that is a Corvette. Like, they don't want to destroy their top sports car. I think my theory is, I think they would have probably done 600 horsepower on the C6 Z06 if the ZR1 came to fruition, or if they would have followed pretty much what the C5 had, they would have pretty much kept it where it was, right? I think they would have pretty much everything could have possibly stayed the same, where the Z06 variant of the generation ahead of the previous, they would have been about the same. The ZR1 and Z06 of that would have been the same, because C5 Z06s and C4 ZR1s had the same power. So I'm like, if they follow that trend, a C6 Z06 should have the same power as a C5 ZR1. But then I'm wondering at that point, how fast would that feel for a C5, right? Like, would that be the best bang for buck at that point? Maybe not, right? Because it is a ZR1. Say ZR1s tend to be expensive, but C4 is not really. Like at that point, no. And then obviously, I think if they gave the LS7 to the C5 Z06s, I think at that point, they probably would have actually figured out that whole valve drop issue. They would have, I think, found that out a lot earlier than when they did on the C6s. Right. Because I'm not, at that point, I'm like, the C5 was an experiment car. This is a, like a, what do you call it? A project car. That's the way I view a C5. Like, I think the C5 was GM's project car, because I'm like, C5 was the first Corvette to receive a torque tube. First time to have 50-50 on its weight, where you have engine front, transmission mounted in the back. All right. They are just trying whatever they can at this point to restart what the C4's disappointment was. It's a plastic bag. Okay. Let's go ahead and, there we go. But right, like, just in general, I'm like, the C4, from a performance standpoint against its own competitors, I think the C4 did kind of disappoint. Cool car, but it just had its flaws. Right? Fast car, yes. Was it anywhere like as reliable? Did it have the praise that all these previous Chevys had with their V8s and whatnot? No, the C4 had its flaws, which sucked, right? And obviously, most people don't really like how the C4 looked. The C4, I think, to a lot of people, is one of the ugliest Corvettes that's ever been made. So, but that's more your opinion. I like the C4. Yeah. I think if they would have went down, I think sometimes I'm like, I wonder what would have happened, but at the same time, I don't think much would have changed either. I think the only thing that would have changed was the fact that an LS7 would have been a part of GM's lineup earlier than 2006. It would have happened in 2001. If they were to do that. But, you know, I like to just think of things that maybe, like, I like to think of what ifs, I guess, for Chevy. What if they did this earlier than they did? What if they tried this? Like, you know, I think they could have done more with that whole setup that they did. Like, I feel like they really could have done more with the torque tube years of the Corvettes. I feel like they could have maximized it more than they did, which I feel like, you know, they did everything they could. They maximized it for the budget they were looking for, right? Because that's the whole goal of the Corvette. They're trying to make the best performance bargain on the market. Regardless if you think it's expensive or not, they're comparing the price to other brands. Right? They're trying to compete with the German cars. German cars are obviously very expensive cars. Quality's way up there, but from a speed standpoint, can the Corvette beat them? Yes. To a certain extent, yes. Like, now, could you build the Corvettes on a budget or any sort of Chevy at that point? Right. I think the only plus side with the Corvette over getting Camaro in that aspect is the fact that same engine, right? So the parts should be the same. Like, they're pretty much interchangeable in what parts you want to upgrade. The only difference is the Corvette weighs less than the Camaro. So if you're like racing, or if you're like doing track days type thing, anything like that, the Corvette would more than likely beat Camaros on tracks, right? Especially if you're a good driver. Now, do I think if you are a decent driver, do I think you could push the Corvette to its limits without scaring yourself, like get the same consistent lap times over and over and over again? Depends on the driver. I think most people could not, because it is a scary concept. You've got muscle car power in a sub 3,000 pound car, right? You've got, these cars are somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 3,300 pounds. So I'm like, that's not from that world. I'm like, if you think about it and then you put the power on how much these cars have, that is not that much. Right? That is scary. Because you're putting, the Camaro has the same power, right? The Camaro's got the same power and everything. The big difference is the weight of the Camaro. Fifth gens weighed about 300 pounds more. Let's see, or not fifth gens, fourth gens. Fourth gens made about 300 pounds more. Fifth gens weighed probably close to 1,000 pounds more, right? Depending on which one you had. I'm like somewhere between 700 to 1,000 pounds more than the C6s, which was insane. C7s with the 6th gen Camaros, again, C7s weighed relatively heavier, but they still made more power per pound, right? The Camaros weighed same power, but weighed, which actually was fairly light, right? They weighed about 400 pounds more. Like, that was a pretty good difference. They lightened the Camaro up with the new chassis. But yeah, I would think, if you try to think about these things, I'm like, I just wonder, what if Chevy made a C7 or C7? What if Chevy made a C5 ZR1? What would have happened with the rest of, I guess, history at that point, right? Like, what would have happened with the C6s? What would have happened with the Camaros? Like, would those cars ever receive an LS7, both of them, at any point? Or would they just keep it, right? Would GM finally, would they go direct injected for the C6? Who knows, you know? But, you know, that's a what if that'll never happen, because obviously that's in the past. We are currently in the C8 world. So, but all right, though, I'm about to head out to work. It is 7:22. You all have a great day. I'm out.